Look, we all know the deal with professional wrestling, right? It's sports entertainment. The punches are pulled, the personalities are dialed way, way up, and most importantly, the outcomes of the matches are completely predetermined. But in this explainer, we're going to examine a moment that completely shattered that illusion. We're talking about a night where the scripted drama of the ring collided violently with very real, very desperate corporate panic. Let's dive in. So the big question is, what actually happens when the script gets completely thrown out the window and the star performer doesn't even know? Well, to understand that, we have to travel back to November 9th, 1997. That date marks literally the most infamous real-life betrayal in the history of the wrestling industry. It's a massive turning point that changed the business forever, destroyed friendships, and launched entirely new eras of television. Okay, so to make sure we're all speaking the same language here, let's define a very specific insider term, a screw job. A screw job is a notorious incident where the predetermined outcome of a match is covertly changed without one of the wrestlers being informed. It is the ultimate betrayal of trust in an industry where performers quite literally put their lives in each other's hands every single night. And the one we're unpacking today? Easily the most heavily publicized double cross since at least 1985. But, to understand why this happened, we have to understand the man pulling the strings, Vince McMahon. Notice the stark contrast in how wrestling used to operate versus his vision. Before the 1980s, wrestling was governed by the NWA's territory system. It was basically this polite gentleman's agreement where promoters stayed in their own regions. But Vince McMahon, he had a completely different idea. He wanted the whole shebang. He aggressively raided rival rosters, bought up their TV time slots, and essentially crushed that traditional system to build a ruthless national empire. Let's just track this real quick. McMahon's father founded Capitol Wrestling back in 1953, but it was in 1982 that Vince Jr. bought the WWF and put his aggressive plan into overdrive. By 1984, he puts the world title on Hulk Hogan. But 1985, that is the absolute linchpin. McMahon gambled the entire future of his company on WrestleMania 1. Literally, if it failed, they were facing bankruptcy. Talk about putting all your chips on the table. But it didn't fail. It was a massive cultural phenomenon that kicked off wrestling's golden era. But what goes up must eventually come down, right? As we move into the 1990s, the bright neon-colored spectacle of that Hulkamania era had pretty much run out of gas. Audiences were evolving, and the cartoonish heroes just weren't drawing those massive crowds anymore. And more importantly, very real, dangerous, real-world problems were suddenly threatening the company's very existence. By 1997, the WWF was operating in a total pressure cooker. Vince McMahon was dodging the fallout of a federal steroid trial that nearly sent him to prison, and the company was bleeding money. To make things worse, their rival promotion, WCW, was absolutely crushing them in the television ratings. WCW had this seemingly endless checkbook, offering massive $3 million a year contracts to lure away WWF's biggest stars. McMahon was losing a financial war, and he desperately needed to cut costs. Which brings us to our two central figures, and wow, they could not be more different. On one side, we have Bret the Hitman Hart. He's a 14-year WWF veteran, a massive hero in his native Canada, and a strict wrestling traditionalist. Facing financial ruin, McMahon actually encouraged Hart to take one of those huge deals with WCW just to get his salary off the books. On the other side is Shawn Michaels, an edgy rule breaker, leader of a powerful backstage group, and someone who had immense, bitter personal animosity towards Hart. Michaels had reportedly told Hart to his face that he would flatly refuse to ever lose a match to him. And that outright refusal, that set the stage for total disaster. Let's head over to Montreal, to the Molson Center, the site of the 1997 Survivor Series. Bret Hart is the WWF champion. He's leaving for WCW in just a matter of weeks, and Vince McMahon is terrified, and I mean terrified, that Hart will take his championship belt to rival television. It had happened with a female wrestler 2 years prior, and Vince wasn't going to let it happen again. So in secret hotel meetings filled with extreme paranoia, McMahon and his inner circle secretly sealed Bret Hart's fate. Now, to keep Hart calm, they finalized a mutually agreed-upon script. Here is what was supposed to happen. First, Shawn Michaels puts Hart in Hart's own signature submission hold, the sharpshooter. Then, Hart was meant to grab Michaels' foot and reverse the pressure. Finally, a bunch of other wrestlers would run down to the ring, a massive brawl breaks out, and the match ends in a disqualification. This plan allowed Bret to keep the title in front of his home country fans with the promise that he'd just hand the belt over peacefully on TV the next night. But the shocking reality was entirely different. Hart completely trusted the referee Earl Hebner, who had actually sworn on his children's lives that he wouldn't double-cross him. But Hebner's job had been secretly threatened by management. So the match begins as planned, and Michaels locks in the sharpshooter. But then, instead of waiting for Brett to reverse it, Hebner abruptly turns and signals for the bell. The ring announcer immediately declares Michaels the winner and the new WWF champion, even though Hart never actually submitted. You might be wondering, how did this all happen so fast? It's because the boss was right there at ringside. As Hart was reaching back to reverse the hold, Vince McMahon, standing right next to the timekeeper, violently elbows him and screams, "Ring the fucking bell." This exact quote really captures the frantic, high-stakes nature of the betrayal. In an absolute instant, a respected 14-year veteran's career in the WWF was ended with a knife to the back right in front of 20,000 of his most passionate fans. As you can probably guess, the immediate aftermath was pure, unadulterated chaos. The live pay-per-view broadcast was cut off 4 minutes early, fading to black almost immediately after Shawn Michaels scurried out of the ring with the belt. But inside the arena, and especially backstage, the entire situation was exploding. Still in the ring, a stunned Bret Hart got to his feet, walked over to the ropes, and spat directly in Vince McMahon's face before just trashing the ringside television monitors. And backstage, it escalated into physical violence. McMahon went into Hart's dressing room to try and explain himself, and Hart punched McMahon right in the temple, dropping him to the floor with a black eye and a concussion. The rest of the locker room was absolutely furious, threatening a massive boycott of the next night's show. And Shawn Michaels? He locked himself away, feigning total ignorance, claiming he had absolutely nothing to do with it. So who actually orchestrated this whole thing? Well, if you ask around, the accounts are completely conflicting. Years later, Shawn Michaels wrote that he flatly volunteered to execute whatever screwjob Vince needed. Writer Vince Russo claims he proposed the finish. Manager Jim Cornette says he was the first one to suggest the sharpshooter spot. And to make things even more crazy, a lot of industry insiders still suspect the entire thing was an elaborate work, meaning a fictional storyline that Bret Hart was secretly in on the whole time. Now, Hart vehemently denies that to this day, and impartial reporting heavily suggests this betrayal was 100% real. The very next night on television, Vince McMahon sat down for an interview to explain his actions to a totally outraged audience, and he delivered this now infamous line. Vince McMahon didn't screw Bret Hart. I truly believe that Bret Hart screwed Bret Hart. McMahon's whole argument was that Hart's stubbornness and his refusal to drop the belt for the good of the company effectively forced his hand. But here is where history takes a truly fascinating turn. This real-world betrayal, it actually, inadvertently, saved the WWF. The fans were so incredibly furious at McMahon that the company decided to lean right into it. They transformed Vince from this unseen corporate owner into the villainous on-screen character known as Mr. McMahon. This tyrannical boss became the absolute perfect rival for a rebellious, beer-drinking wrestler named Stone Cold Steve Austin. This rivalry launched the wildly successful Attitude Era and effectively won the Monday Night Wars against WCW. So, what does this all mean for the long-term legacy of the event? Well, for over a decade, Bret Hart absolutely refused to speak to Vince McMahon or Shawn Michaels. The pain of the Montreal Screwjob hung like a dark cloud over the entire wrestling industry. For the longest time, it seemed like an open wound that would never, ever heal. But, incredibly, time actually started doing its thing. Let's look at how this played out. The screwjob happened in November 1997. It took 9 full years, until April 2006, for Bret Hart to finally return to be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame, though he completely avoided Michaels that night. It took another 4 years, until January 2010, for Hart and Michaels to finally meet in the center of the ring on live television, where they shook hands, embraced, and genuinely reconciled. And today, as of April 2026, Shawn Michaels is a highly respected executive successfully running the WWE's NXT brand, mentoring the next generation of stars. Which really leaves us with one final, massive question. Does time heal all wounds in the pursuit of sports entertainment? In an industry built entirely on blurred lines between reality and fiction, where betrayals are normally just part of the script, the Montreal Screwjob stands out because it was agonizingly, brutally real. It's a stark reminder that behind every scripted show there are real people with very real breaking points. Yet somehow, even the most bitter enemies eventually found a way to forgive. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. It's been a wild ride, and I'll see you next time.